Thank you very much, John. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here for me. Although at the end of my presentation, you will see that me too, I have reasons to be pessimistic about the future of rhythm control therapy, at least with drugs. Now, if we turn our attention to the last 15 years, there was only one drug which actually was approved by authorities for long-term treatment of atrial fibrillation. That is, of course, dronedarone. I'm showing this slide just to emphasize to you what it takes to develop antiarrhythmic drug from scratch on to approval by authorities. The trial program of dronedarone was quite extensive, and it took almost 10,000 patients to be enrolled in these trials to get the drug finally approved for rhythm control or for avoidance of hard endpoints such as hospitalization or death. This, of course, is the outcome. I'm showing the slide just to emphasize to you that it's a composite endpoint, like many of these studies or all of these studies used, hospitalization or death. But this is no longer satisfactory for the authorities. They look for, and John has mentioned this, for irreversible harm as the outcomes of choice for antiarrhythmic drug development. So only mortality, stroke, or MI would be suitable in their opinion to constitute endpoints of antiarrhythmic drug trials. Now, while we were working on the dronedarone development program, many said this is a very dirty drug, such as amiodarone, the mother compound of dronedarone, and that cannot be good, and we have to turn our attention to more selective ion channel blockade. And as a result of this, you can see it from this list, which is not demanding completeness at all. I'm sure I have not all of these compounds listed here, but there's a long list of IKUR blockers or IKACH blockers, which are supposed to be selective ion channel blockers. And you can see from the cartoon, which shows you action potentials from human atrial myocytes in sinus rhythm in the upper row and in atrial fibrillation in the lower row, that these drugs actually, if ion selectivity is increased from the left to the right, that then only in atrial fibrillation there's significant prolongation of the action potential duration by these compounds. So from a theoretical point of view, this class of drugs actually constituted or was very appealing to many of us. So they went on and moved the drug into clinical development, and I'm showing only 2 slides on studies on this. This happened to be a phase 2 study where John and I were involved with a compound from Serbia. And there was an IKUR blocker, obviously. And a trial was set up in patients with paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. And all of these patients had implantable loop recorders to actually determine very precisely the AF burden. And they were then randomly allocated to one of 3 dosages of the compound or to placebo. The trial had to be stopped after enrollment for 58 patients due to preclinical safety concerns. But what I'm showing you is this cartoon. And all to the left in blue would mean that you have a decrease in atrial fibrillation burden, and to the right you would have an increase in AF burden. And you can see for all of the dosages tested, there's a scatter of effects. So clearly there was no beneficial action to be discerned in that study of this particular IKUR blocker. Similar findings were reported then for other selective ion channel blockers. This happens to be one example also here. And again, to make a long story short, all of these studies fell apart because of low efficacy. So that brings us to the next idea people developed, and that is to move again from selective ion channel blockers not only to dirty drugs, but to combinations of dirty drugs. And that brings in the late sodium current blocker ranolazine. And there was a study after extensive preclinical work where the combination of these two compounds was tested against placebo, the so-called Harmony trial. And that was published a number of years ago. And what you will see in this study, this compared the combination drug therapy to the single components and to placebo. And it is important to emphasize that the amount of tronidazole was exactly half of that used in the tronidazole development program. For instance, in the AFNET trial, we used 2 times 400 milligram. Here, they used 2 times 225 milligram. And what you can see from this figure here, that with a combination therapy, you have a highly significant suppression of atrial fibrillation, and the burden over 12 weeks, and that was again assessed by implantable pacemakers, significantly fell in those patients who were treated with a combination therapy. So I looked at this as a very promising concept. Unfortunately, the sponsor of the combination therapy decided not to develop this any further for various reasons, I should say. So John has already pointed out what is currently on the horizon. I'm not going to belabor the SK channel inhibitors, except to say that we really do not know how selective they are. At least functionally, they seem to be atrial selective, and there's currently a cardioversion study going on with this compound. And another interesting new compound, a small startup company in Germany has developed this compound. It's a small molecule, OMT28. And the uniqueness of that molecule is that it has, at least in a preclinical setting, it has been shown to have antiarrhythmic activity, but also cardioprotective and antifibrotic potential in different in vivo models. And this is one of the few compounds I'm aware of currently, which is undergoing a phase 2 study with a goal of maintenance of sinus rhythm, not a cardioversion study, but a maintenance of sinus rhythm study. So to sum up, I'd like to point out, very much like John did, that the obstacles in antiarrhythmic drug development are many. Number one would probably be the lack of agreement between intriguing effects of new compounds in experimental models and the findings in human studies, as I have indicated to you. Another obstacle, without any doubt, is that authorities will likely demand large outcome studies such as AFNET, but I already alluded your attention to the fact that they are calling for irreversible harm endpoints such as death or stroke or MI. Hospitalization alone or in combination with in form of a composite endpoint will not be acceptable anymore. So the AFNET endpoint, for instance, would not be acceptable. And that, I think, will slow down antiarrhythmic drug therapy significantly and makes this particularly challenging. Thank you very much for your attention.